welcome. Today I'm talking with Professor Martina Linnenluecke and Professor Tom Smith, both from Macquarie University. The topic of today's conversation is their paper published in the Australian Journal of Management special issue on Grand Challenges. The title of the paper is Grand Challenges in Management Research, Attributes, Achievements and Advancement. Here is the interview. So welcome Martina and Tom. Martina, if you could take us through a bit of an overview about your paper in AJM's Grand Challenge special issue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Victoria. So I'm just briefly going to share my screen, give you a bit of an idea about the different papers that we do have in the special issue, and also just to give a general introduction into the framework. So the whole idea behind the special issue was that we really wanted to bring a Grand Challenge focus into the conversation here in the Asia-Pacific region. We felt that there's so many challenges that this region is facing. It's obviously a very diverse region as well. And we really felt that scholarship hasn't quite fully explored all the various issues and challenges that we are really seeing here. So we put out this call for papers with a really broad focus, essentially asking authors to think through what the big challenges are and also what we can do in order to address them. So just to give a bit of a reflection on our special issue, I mean, one of the big issues obviously that we are facing in this whole area of Grand Challenges research is that Grand Challenges, the term itself, has been used very loosely in the past. I mean, authors have used the term Grand Challenges to refer to all sorts of different issues in management research. So you can see that it ranges from issues such as climate change, which is obviously a very global problem, to much more localized types of issues that we are seeing within certain communities, for instance, in terms of health outcomes. So obviously, we felt that there's also a little bit of a lack of focus of how this term is really defined, and especially also how it can be applied to a specific context such as the Asia-Pacific region. And we thought it would be really interesting to put this special issue together because we see just so much diversity in the Asia-Pacific region in terms of geography, economy, social types of issues, right? So we thought it's a really good opportunity here for scholars to make a contribution. Obviously, I think we've all experienced the direct effects of Grand Challenges when we think back to the Black Summer bushfires over the 2019-2020 summer in Australia. I think these fires have in particular brought to our attention the large-scale types of changes that we might be seeing as a result of issues such as climate change. And I think especially here for Australia, that was definitely a wake-up call in terms of the potential size of the challenge and the enormity of the challenge that we could be facing. So the special issue, and you will see that from our introductory paper as well, we've tried to sort of group that around different dimensions in order to provide a little bit of a framework and more clarity as well on how we can think about and how we can structure Grand Challenges. So we have introduced the geographical scope for the challenge, and we have also looked into essentially the stakeholders that are being affected by any particular challenges. And we have subdivided here, as you can see, our framework into 4 different quadrants. So we do have challenges that are more narrow in scope, that focus only on a single country or region and affect a narrower range of stakeholders. But then we also have challenges that are much bigger in scope, and they might essentially affect entire regions, or they might even be global in their nature and affect a much larger stakeholder base. So we've given a few examples here. So for instance, climate change, we would definitely categorize it as a global issue that has got enormously widespread impact on large stakeholder groups globally. And that obviously is then tied to other types of challenges that might manifest themselves into more regional types of issues here as well. Obviously, we might see some dynamics here as well. So for instance, thinking about the global financial crisis, that obviously didn't start just as a global financial crisis from the onset. It originated in a particular region of the world and then had a large effect globally, right? So we've also taken into account here that there might be some dynamics going on here as well. I think it was really interesting for the special issue to see the different papers that we received and how they fit within this framework. And we were really excited because essentially we got papers that addressed all the various different quadrants of our framework. So we do have papers that were focusing more on sort of more local or regional issues. So for instance, the energy transition in Australia, very interesting paper here by Dodd and Nelson. We've also got papers focusing on issues such as crowdsourcing, again, more locally focused, looking into issues, how we can potentially resolve grand challenges, address those challenges by tapping into the wisdom of crowds. But then we have got other papers here that are tackling issues at different levels. So we see papers in this special issue on the impacts of climate change on energy and financial markets by Ashley Ding. We have also got a work here on the digitization and automation by McCready and colleagues, also a very interesting paper, I think. Then we do have papers that are tackling multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral issues. So for instance, the biosecurity paper here by Brian and Higgins. And I think also very, very important for the Asia Pacific region, papers looking into the refugee crisis. So by Ned Quayle and colleagues from QUT, also I think a fantastic paper. And then we lastly have got papers in this upper quadrant here looking into the large grand societal challenges, right? We do have work here on degrowth, tackling this entire issue around what do we actually do? Are we growing infinitely, or do we actually see the potential here for some degrowth in the future? And I think we are experiencing degrowth at the moment due to the COVID crisis. So I think this is a very topical contribution here, discussing and reviewing the particular literature here as well. And also we have contributions on the Sustainable Development Goals by Christ and Barrett in the special issue as well, essentially looking into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and tying that also to our work in academia and essentially looking into how we can work towards the implementation of these particular goals as well. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting, very diverse special issue, and we've definitely all been very delighted to be the editors on this work, because I think the papers here set just such a precedent for future work in this area. So we were definitely very delighted to be the editors for the special issue here. We've also offered our own observation, which is sort of the last point in our introductory paper as well, and what can we actually do to address grand challenges. And this is not an easy part of actually working with grand challenges, because they're diverse and they obviously cannot be solved through a single intervention. And what we found in the literature is that there are some attempts already looking at what we can do. So one potential avenue is to look into distributed problem solving and experimentation. And that could be an avenue here where we could have, for instance, a central authority, a funder, or other types of bodies that would essentially support diverse and parallel teams looking for solutions. And I think this is very similar to what we are seeing at the moment with the search for the vaccine, right? Where we do see this type of distributed problem-solving approach happening in practice to try and find a solution to the coronavirus crisis. Other approaches involving different types of stakeholders and harnessing their expertise. So for instance, drawing upon indigenous knowledge, which I think was definitely a point that was missed when it came to addressing the bushfire risk in Australia. What we can also do is looking into scaling down challenges, global challenges, to potentially make them a little bit more tangible at a local level. So these are sort of some initial approaches that we see in the literature, but our hope is definitely that researchers will build on this framework, on these approaches in the future, to give us further ideas and further inspiration for what we can actually do to tackle many of these very, very protected and very difficult issues in the future. So yeah, that was just a very, very brief overview of the special issue and the contributions here. So yeah, we're definitely happy to take a few more questions and dive a little bit deeper into this issue.
I could probably talk a little bit about how the idea of the special issue came about. as researchers, we tend to be very narrowly focused, right? So we might be a capital market researcher looking at the effect of information disclosure on corporate value. So what we wanted to do was to give, we've got some great researchers, is to give them a chance to work on the big important ideas. And, they're loosely referred to as the grand challenges. And I think we've got to give Martina a lot of credit here, because she encourages us all to work on the big important ideas, right? And there might not be an obvious outlet for that in the current tier ones, but of course, the big important issues are big and important, and we should be working on. So it was great to get a very diverse group of academics together working on these big important issues in the Asia region. And a lot of the work was cross-disciplinary. And it's just a chance to get outside of your narrow little silo, right? There's an expression, right? Don't die with the music in you, right? You've got something to offer to these really, really big, important issues. And this was an opportunity for you to get together with your colleagues, cross-disciplinary, and have a go at this, right? At the time, a couple of big issues were in one part of the quadrant, right, which were localized to one country, and like the bushfires. We didn't have a paper specifically on that, but another one was the zero growth or degrowth. So at the time, that was focused in Japan, and probably across a few shareholder groups, right? And Japan, for a couple of decades, had been in a state of zero or degrowth, right? But of course, very prophetic, the Grand Challenge special issue, now since then we've had the COVID, and of course every country in the world is in a period of degrowth, right? Which would have been unimaginable, last year, this time last year. So some of these have turned out to be even more important, and shifted in the taxonomy. They've shifted from one quadrant to another. So it's been very interesting to see, and there's a lot of cites of these papers already. All of them I think were excellent papers, and it was a really good process. We even had a really nice conference, where all the papers would come together. I think at your campus, Victoria, it was very nice of you to host it, and the people presented and got feedback. And still continued in the review process, but it was a very enjoyable experience.
So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, find out a little bit more. So first off, what are the key insights for industry, policymakers, and/or employees from your paper published in AJM's special issue Grand Challenges?
I think one of the implications is definitely a call for action for policymakers and also for industry to really engage with and look into the great challenges that we've got ahead. I mean, obviously at the moment we see a strong focus on COVID, and for very good reasons, right? It has been extremely impactful on pretty much every sector, and lots of companies are struggling at the moment. So I think the focus is definitely warranted. However, I think what we've also seen is just how vulnerable our society is when it comes to large-scale challenges. And looking into the future, it won't stop with COVID. We can see all the evidence at the moment that climate change is going to be our next big issue that we need to tackle, and that we need to tackle urgently. So we know the science is telling us this is going to happen, and it's going to happen not just in 50 to 100 years time. We will see more drastic impacts already over the next decade or so. And I think this has become very evident, not just with the Australian bushfires, but we've also got bushfires in other regions and other types of extreme events as well, right? For instance, when we look into the US at the moment, they have also had to deal with a significant wildfire crisis, and they're certainly not the only country on this planet being faced with more extreme events. So the call for industry, and I think the call for policymakers, is to really look into how can we create more resilient societies, and not just in terms of how do we adapt to these types of changes, but also what can we do to mitigate these types of impacts, right? There's a great opportunity to act now, to push for more adoption of clean energy, for instance, right? We do have the technology available. It makes good business sense to implement those technologies right now at the moment, which would definitely go a long way towards future-proofing our economy. I think what we've also seen in particular due to the COVID crisis is just the whole fragility of the system. We've obviously don't have very resilient systems in place. We've essentially been completely dismantled internationally, right, by the impact of the virus. So we see the breakdown of supply chains, we see the breakdown of international travel, we see essentially just a complete deconstruction of systems that we did have in place. So I think another call to action here, and another important policy insight, is also that we really need to think about future-proofing important services and important infrastructures, and also our supply chains, which would obviously require some consideration of how we can best do it, right? So the solution is obviously not just to nationalize everything, but I think it just requires future consideration in terms of, what do we actually do with this really global interconnected system in order to prevent breakdowns happening in the future as well. So I think that there are lots of lessons learned here. And lastly, I think a very important point is also, once we face these challenges, what can we actually do to address them? And I think we have seen the importance just of science, right? We've seen the importance of actually having scientific knowledge, of having functioning health systems and so on. So in the future, I think that also needs to be a consideration of how do we actually fund these systems, right? And what can we do to sort of really harness that knowledge to provide us with solutions.
Yeah, so I think, just thinking about what these grand challenges are is really important, right? And we've got a very good list of them. Some of these things are actuarially certain, right? You can look ahead 10, 20, 50 years and know for sure that there's going to be a pandemic, and there's going to be, threats and opportunities from climate change. And in fact, if you go back to, and just going to the pandemic, if you go back to the actuarial science papers in the early 2000s, they were basically 50% chance of a pandemic in the next 10 years and 100% chance in the next 20 years. From a policy point of view, if you went and looked at the financial statements of all the top companies in the world, how many do you think would have an allowance, right, for a pandemic, right, losses in a pandemic? I would say zero, right? And from a policy point of view, for an event that was a policy misstep, right? So that's very important. And it's only now that we're seeing action on provision for losses that are actually certain from climate change. Now, accounting is the way we report is conservative. There's also a lot of opportunities, right? I'm not going to talk about opportunities from the pandemic, but there's a lot of opportunities around global environmental change too, and in particular the transition to clean technology. The other thing that's important is the way you can bring researchers cross-disciplinary to work on this, and you can see the results there. They've obviously enjoyed working together, and they've produced some really good outputs. And then finally, the ways to coordinate action, right? And we, as Martina pointed out, we definitely see the coordinated approach, with the COVID vaccine, right? So, a lot of the things there were very, prophetic, right, about what we're seeing now. But, I think one of the things it highlights is we're very good with something that's going to happen in the short term, whether it may or may not happen, right? We're very good with handling that risk and making provision for it. But something in the longer term, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, even if it's actually certain, we're not good at making provision for that or assessing the risk of that. Because if we were, every single company in the world would have had some provision for the actuarially sure pandemic.
Yeah, I really like the way in your paper that you've classified into the 4 different quadrants. I think that's a great way of then thinking in the future, how are people contributing to looking at those grand challenges? So I think that's very good. So we've talked and mentioned quite a bit COVID-19, but I think in particular, is there some aspects of the pandemic that, within your paper been accentuated? Maybe there's core messages, a call to more research. How do you think the pandemic has affected the Grand Challenges research, and any unexpected things like the work from home, less travel? What are your thoughts?
Well, we're going to do a segue to another special issue that you might want to interview the editors on, because the Australian Journal of Management also has another special issue on the future of work, right? And I believe that was commissioned prior to the COVID, but what a great thing to be looking at, right? Because the pandemic has drastically changed how we think about the future of work, right? So it's a little bit of cross advertising here.
Yeah, I mean, in the future, I think what we definitely need to focus on are these types of approaches, right, that I think allow us to some extent to go about our normal lives as usual, right, but also approaches that allow us to have greater preparedness when it comes to the unexpected, right. I think the pandemic, I mean, we didn't obviously foresee that at the time when we put the special issue together, but for looking at it now, we can definitely see how we would classify it, and it would fall into the quadrant of being a global or multi-regional challenge and affecting essentially every type of country on this planet, right? So it becomes essentially a large-scale multi-stakeholder issue as well. And these challenges are obviously not very easy to solve, right? We can see the difficulties that we do have in terms of actually getting collaboration and cooperation happening. And I think we can also see just really interesting sort of developments at the moment, right? Some countries managing it extremely well. I think New Zealand and Australia are definitely amongst them. And then we also see overseas jurisdictions where ultimately there is quite a fair bit of breakdown in terms of, the public systems, the policy, but also the trust in government. We've, recently just published another paper on this as well, looking into issues around the future of business and in society in relation to COVID as well, focusing on the US context. And the challenges there become really evident when we look into the current political situation. So going into the future from here, I think these types of challenges are obviously not going to go away, right? So I think we need to become, better at actually generating good, solid responses. What we've seen in the past, I think 6 months or so, is also that science has really mattered, right, in terms of bringing us a vaccine, but we also see a distrust in science. We see a distrust in government. So I think these are really interesting sort of tensions where I would like to see future work coming out here as well, of how can this actually be managed? What can we do to have more successful approaches, right? So I think these are definitely tensions that we see at the moment happening and playing out, and just having management approaches that are actually looking into, okay, what can we do to more successfully manage the global challenges that are ahead of us? I think that would be really important work in the future.
So I'd just like to pick up on the collaboration and cooperation part of what Martina was talking about, right? So because of the pandemic, universities had to pivot on a dime and suddenly have all online classes. And there was enormous cooperation and collaboration across the teachers in Australian space. And I'm going to credit you, Victoria, for a lot of that, because you invested substantial time and energy into the online teaching space. And another colleague, Dr. Amanda, also, and you guys were incredibly cooperative in sharing your expertise across this whole area, and it really, really helped everyone. And that really, it really shows that this collaboration, cooperation adaptation and resilience is there, right? I really felt during that period part of a very caring, sharing, supportive community of scholars. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And so I just want to ask you, what are some future research directions or anything you'd like to share that you're working on at the moment?
So yeah, we're definitely, we are very much focused, right? You can see Martina's got behind it the Center for Corporate Sustainability and Environmental Finance. We are very much focused on putting dollars and cents on the threats and opportunities of global environmental change. It's actuarially certain that we will be going to a sustainable world. Hence, it's actuarially certain that all the finance will be sustainable finance, right? And all bonds will be green bonds, right? So we're a little bit ahead of the curve, right? Like 6 years probably ahead of the curve with this, but we want to create opportunities for everyone around us. So that's essentially what we're doing. And then, of course, Martina goes further with this, right, of all the different possible scenarios, and then looking at the adaptation and mitigation aspects of that. Very interesting work on relocation of firms, because that's Martina's got a very well-cited theory paper, but now empirically we're seeing lots and lots and lots of firms relocated just because of the changing climate and changing conditions. They just can't stay in the location where they are. How do you evaluate the patents that are out there? We're actually certain there's going to be a transition to clean technology. Well, there's opportunities, right? So, and you can see these opportunities in the form of patents. So, what's the valuation aspects of that? What are the reporting aspects, right, of that? What standards should we have for disclosure of these risks and the opportunities, right, and the dollar value? Should we disclose only the downside, right, or should we be talking about some potential opportunities that could be, multi-billion-dollar gains to businesses, right? That's always a big dilemma in the reporting process. We're very good. Well, we haven't been so good with the pandemic in having the loss provisions, but we are quicker to record the losses than to flag any potential gains. So lots and lots of things.
I think from my perspective, what's also going to be really interesting to see is obviously the current interplay that we see from the pandemic and what that actually means in terms of impacts of climate change, impacts on climate change, and also impacts on the clean energy transition, because I think they're sort of like different forces in play here as well. Obviously, the lockdowns have led to some reductions in our carbon emissions, but from what we can see already, that it's potentially not a lasting a trajectory or a different trajectory that we are on. But by the same degree, we also see large stimulus packages being announced, in particular overseas. Europe, I think, has been leading in that regard, as well as a few other nations. And so we will see quite a fair bit of economic stimulus going as well into green technologies or clean technologies. So I think what's going to be so interesting to see in the future is how all this is actually going to work out in terms of how is that going to impact climate change. I mean, my hope personally is that the pandemic has really drawn to our attention the global risks that we are facing, and that we do live in very uncertain times. However, by the same degree, I'm also worried that, essentially the transition is not going to happen fast enough with the time frame that we do have available, because we're already committed to a certain degree of warming. And what has me also worried is, that we just see so much skepticism when it comes to really solid science, actually. That just always surprises me so much, because, there's just essentially a big pushback when it comes to these types of findings that are suggesting that we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And perhaps this is just people being essentially very scared of the future and not wanting to see the reality behind it. So I think we need to have further research as well looking into that, and how we can positively engage with communities and with stakeholders to essentially drive these types of changes, because they will just be so important for us in the future. future, because we do need a secure environment to live in. And obviously, if we do have runaway climate change, this is not going to be happening. So I think research has definitely got a very good opportunity as well here to tackle these types of questions as well.
Well, thank you both very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Well, thank you so much.
Pleasure, Victoria. Thank you. Thank you.